Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the very warm and generous introductions. I want to thank Demos and the ACLU and the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. It's just really an honor to be here. Well, let me acknowledge at the outset that the argument that I'm going to make tonight and that I make in my book is hard for a lot of folks to swallow, particularly if you yourself have never spent time in prison or have been labeled a felon. But here's the claim that I make in the book and spend nearly 300 pages proving with voluminous data, evidence, and testimony. Today, in the so-called era of color blindness, something akin to a racial caste system exists in America. This is not the cheerful, optimistic message you'll hear at most Black History Month gatherings that are still trumpeting the election of Barack Obama. But it is, I believe, the truth, a truth that we as a nation have gone to great lengths to deny, or perhaps it's more accurate to say to avoid knowing. For those of you who might be tempted to dismiss this type of claim out of hand, I just encourage you to keep an open mind. I myself dismissed this claim more than a decade ago, a fact I now regret. As I discuss in the introduction to my book, I first encountered the idea of a new racial caste system more than a decade ago when a bright orange poster caught my eye. I was rushing to catch the bus in Oakland, and I saw this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole, and on it it said, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I stopped for a minute and kind of scanned the text of the flyer, and I saw that, a radical community group was holding a meeting in a local church just a few blocks away, and they were going to be organizing to protest the new 3 strikes law in California, the expansion of the prison system and police brutality. And I remember, thinking to myself, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street and hopped on the bus on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU. Well, when I began my work at the ACLU, I assumed that the criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way, all institutions in our society are infected with conscious and unconscious bias. As a civil rights lawyer, I had worked on employment discrimination cases where, racial stereotyping, racial bias permeates subjective decision-making at all levels of institutions, and I saw, the devastating consequences of institutional discrimination. So when I went to the ACLU, I shifted my focus from employment discrimination to criminal justice reform and kind of dedicated myself to the task of rooting out racial bias wherever and whenever it would rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to believe that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It was not just another institution infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. The activists who post the sign on the telephone pole were not crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and activists around the country that were beginning to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial control. So quite belatedly, really, I came to see that mass incarceration in the United States has come to function as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of social control analogous to Jim Crow. I state on page 2 of the introduction, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, all the old forms of discrimination, housing discrimination, employment discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. You know, as a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect. Not sure.
You're being censored.
I guess so. It is a conspiracy. As a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Well, here are some facts I uncovered in the course of my research for writing this book that you probably haven't heard on the evening news. More African Americans are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began.